I never wanted revenge. I just wanted peace. But sometimes, the universe has a way of delivering both. Let me tell you about the day I realized that staying silent was the most dangerous thing I could do to someone who thrived on control. This is the story of how my toxic ex tried to erase me from my own life, and how one quiet, calculated move brought everything crashing down on him in ways I never could have planned myself. His name was Derek. When we met, I was 24, working at a marketing firm in Austin, Texas, trying to build something meaningful with my career and my life. He was 27, charming in that effortless way that makes you feel like you've been chosen for something special. He had this ability to make a crowded room feel empty except for the two of you. I fell hard, and I fell fast. The first 6 months were intoxicating. He'd show up at my apartment with coffee exactly how I liked it, remember tiny details from conversations I'd forgotten we'd even had, and talk about our future like it was this guaranteed beautiful thing just waiting for us to step into it. My friends loved him. My family thought I'd finally found someone stable. Even my boss commented once that I seemed happier, lighter. I didn't see the shift happening because it was so gradual. It started with small comments that felt like care. He'd suggest I shouldn't wear certain outfits to work because they might give the wrong impression. He'd question why I needed to go out with my girlfriends when we could spend that time together. He'd look hurt when I wanted space, making me feel selfish for needing an evening to myself. Then came the deeper stuff. The gaslighting that made me question my own memory. I'd tell him something bothered me, and 2 days later he'd swear the conversation never happened. I'd remember plans we'd made, and he'd make me feel crazy for being so certain about something he claimed we never discussed. Slowly, methodically, he rewired my brain to doubt itself. The worst part wasn't the big blowout fights. It was the quiet erosion of who I was. He had this way of making me feel like every failure was mine, every problem was something I'd caused, every moment of tension was because I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. When I got upset, he'd stay calm, which made me look unhinged. When I tried to explain how I felt, he'd use my own words against me later, twisting them into proof that I was the unstable one. My friends started to notice before I did. Sarah, my best friend since college, pulled me aside one night after Derek had accidentally double-booked our plans for the 3rd time. She said I'd changed. That I apologized for things that weren't my fault. That I looked smaller somehow, like I was taking up less space in the world. I defended him. Of course I did. Because by then, he'd convinced me that any criticism of him was really just people trying to come between us. The control intensified. He needed to know where I was constantly. He'd call during work meetings, and if I didn't answer, there'd be 15 texts waiting, each one more anxious than the last. He framed it as love, as worry, as caring too much. But it was surveillance. He wanted access to my email, said couples shouldn't have secrets. He'd go through my phone while I was in the shower, then casually mention something from a conversation he shouldn't have known about. I started walking on eggshells, calculating every word before I spoke, every decision before I made it. Would this upset him? Would this start a fight? Would this turn into a 3-hour circular conversation where I ended up apologizing for something I still didn't understand? My world got smaller and smaller until it was just him, just us, just this suffocating reality that I'd somehow agreed to without realizing what I was signing up for. The breaking point came, but not in the way you'd expect. I didn't finally stand up for myself. I didn't have some moment of clarity where I saw him for who he really was. Instead, I made one mistake, one tiny human error, and he weaponized it in a way that destroyed everything I'd built. I was working on a major campaign at work, something that could have been a real career milestone. The stress was intense, the hours were brutal, and I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. Derek wasn't supportive. He was resentful. He'd make comments about how my job was more important to me than he was, how I was choosing my career over our relationship. Every late night at the office became evidence of my failing as a partner. One evening, I was supposed to meet him for dinner. I was so buried in work, so deep in spreadsheets and client revisions, that I completely forgot. Not ignored, forgot. My phone was on silent because I was in the zone, and by the time I checked it 3 hours later, there were 47 missed calls and texts that ranged from concerned to angry to something darker. I called him immediately, apologizing profusely. It was an honest mistake, the kind that happens when you're overwhelmed and exhausted. He was silent on the phone, which was somehow worse than yelling. He just said, "We'll talk about this later," and hung up. What happened next was calculated destruction. Derek didn't just break up with me. He launched a campaign to dismantle my reputation, my relationships, and my sense of reality. He started by telling my friends his version of events. Not the simple truth that I'd forgotten dinner, but an elaborate narrative where I'd been cheating on him, where that night was just the final proof, where he'd been loyal and patient while I'd been sneaking around behind his back. He was convincing because he'd always been charming, because people liked him, because he could cry on command and make himself the victim so perfectly that questioning him felt cruel. He showed them text messages, but they were cropped, missing context, arranged to look like evidence of infidelity when they were really just innocent conversations with a male colleague about work. One by one, I watched my friends pull away. Some blocked me outright. Others just went quiet, stopped responding to messages, made excuses when I tried to make plans. Sarah, who'd been worried about me, who'd tried to warn me, even she started to doubt. Derek had gotten to her first, shown her his evidence, played the heartbroken boyfriend so well that my truth sounded like desperate lies. But he didn't stop there. He went to my workplace. Not directly to my boss, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he befriended one of the senior partners at a networking event, casually mentioned he was going through a hard breakup, painted a picture of an unstable ex-girlfriend who was obsessed with him, who might show up or cause problems. He planted seeds of doubt about my mental state, my professionalism, my reliability. Suddenly, I was being left out of important meetings. Projects I'd been leading were quietly reassigned. My boss started checking in on me with questions that felt less like concern and more like evaluation. Was I doing okay? Was everything stable at home? Did I need to take some time off to deal with personal issues? I felt like I was losing my mind. The life I'd built was crumbling, and I couldn't stop it because I didn't even understand what was happening. Derek had blocked me on everything, so I couldn't defend myself to him, couldn't ask him to stop. And when I tried to tell people the truth, I sounded paranoid. Who would believe that someone would go through such elaborate lengths to hurt an ex? It seemed crazy, dramatic, like something out of a movie. The public humiliation was the worst part. Derek posted on social media, nothing directly accusatory, just sad quotes about betrayal and trust, vague posts about healing from toxic relationships. His friends commented with support, with anger on his behalf, with messages that clearly painted me as the villain even though my name was never mentioned. I saw the screenshots circulating, saw myself becoming the cautionary tale, the crazy ex, the girl who'd fooled everyone. I stopped going out. Stopped posting online. Stopped trying to defend myself because every attempt just made me look more guilty, more unstable. I'd become exactly what he'd accused me of, isolated, paranoid, broken. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Would sit in my apartment at night wondering how one forgotten dinner had spiraled into the complete destruction of my life. My work performance suffered because how could it not? I was running on empty, emotionally devastated, professionally sabotaged. The campaign I'd been working on launched without my name attached. I was passed over for a promotion I'd been promised. And through it all, I kept thinking that maybe Derek was right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I deserved this. That's what gaslighting does. It makes you complicit in your own destruction. It makes you believe that the abuse is justified, that you brought it on yourself, that if you'd just been better, different, more, it wouldn't have happened. I hit rock bottom on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting in my car outside my apartment, too exhausted to go inside, too numb to care. My phone buzzed with another message from a former friend telling me to leave Derek alone, to stop spreading lies about him, to get help. I hadn't contacted Derek in weeks. I hadn't spread anything about anyone. But it didn't matter. His narrative had won. That's when something shifted. Not some dramatic moment of empowerment, not a sudden surge of strength. It was quieter than that. It was exhaustion giving way to clarity. I was tired of defending myself against accusations that weren't true. Tired of trying to convince people who'd already made up their minds. Tired of letting his lies define my reality. I stopped responding. Stopped explaining. Stopped trying to control the narrative he'd created. And I started watching. Started paying attention. Started noticing the cracks in his perfect victim performance. Because here's the thing about people who build their lives on manipulation: they get comfortable. They get sloppy. They start to believe their own lies so completely that they forget to cover their tracks. I noticed that Derek had moved on quickly, too quickly for someone who was supposedly devastated by betrayal. Less than a month after our breakup, he was in a new relationship with someone from his gym. Her name was Melissa, and from what I could see on social media, through mutual connections, she was falling into the same pattern I had. The whirlwind romance, the intensity, the constant posts about how she'd finally found real love. I felt sorry for her, but I didn't reach out. What would I say? What could I tell her that wouldn't sound like the jealous ex he'd already warned her about? So I stayed quiet and I watched. I also started documenting everything. Not obsessively, not like some stalker, but carefully. Every time someone sent me a message accusing me of something I hadn't done, I screenshotted it. Every time I heard through the grapevine about something Derek had said about me, I wrote it down with dates and names. I gathered the real text messages, the full conversations he'd cropped, the emails that showed the truth of what our relationship had been. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building a record, protecting myself, making sure that if this ever escalated, if he ever pushed too far, I'd have proof. I'd have evidence. I'd have the truth documented in a way that couldn't be twisted. It took months. Months of silence, of patience, of resisting the urge to scream my truth to anyone who would listen. But gradually, I started to notice things changing. My boss stopped asking if I was okay and started giving me more responsibility. Colleagues who'd been distant started warming up again. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. And Derek kept being Derek. That was the beautiful part, the part one hadn't anticipated. I didn't need to destroy him. He was doing it himself. I heard through mutual connections that his relationship with Melissa was intense, consuming, isolating. That she'd stopped hanging out with her friends. That she seemed stressed, on edge, different. I heard that Derek had been let go from his job, something about inappropriate behavior with a coworker, making someone uncomfortable with his persistence. Then I heard about the fight. A very public fight at a bar where Derek and Melissa had been with friends. Apparently, Derek had gone through Melissa's phone, accused her of cheating based on some innocent conversation, made a scene that ended with her leaving in tears and him being asked to leave the bar. Multiple people witnessed it. Multiple people who knew Derek, who'd believed his story about me, who now saw him treating someone else exactly the way I'd tried to tell them he'd treated me. That's when I made my move. Not the big move, not yet, but the first careful step. I reached out to Sarah. Just a simple message: "Hey, I miss you." No pressure, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. She responded 2 days later. We met for coffee. She apologized before I could say anything. Told me she'd been seeing concerning things with Derek and Melissa. Told me she'd started to wonder if she'd gotten the story wrong. Told me that she'd always had this nagging feeling that something about Derek's version didn't quite add up, but she'd pushed it down because he'd seemed so genuinely hurt. I didn't gloat. Didn't say I told you so. I just told her the truth. Showed her the documented conversations, the full context of everything Derek had cropped and twisted. Explained what gaslighting was, how it had worked on me, how I doubted my own reality because he was so good at making his lies sound like truth. Sarah cried. Then she got angry. Then she asked what she could do to help. I told her nothing. I told her I was rebuilding, that I was okay, that I just wanted my friend back. And I meant it. I didn't want her to go on some campaign on my behalf. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my own head. But Sarah did something I hadn't asked for. She talked to other people, not gossiping, not starting drama, but quietly correcting the record. Showing them what I'd shown her. Letting them draw their own conclusions. The whisper network that had destroyed me started working in reverse, and I wasn't even pushing it. The truth, once it had space to breathe, started spreading on its own. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't known I was waiting for it. Derek reached out to me. After months of silence, months of blocking me and painting me as the villain, he sent me a message through a mutual friend. He wanted to talk. He wanted to clear the air. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking and realized that maybe things hadn't ended the right way between us. The old me would have jumped at the chance. Would have seen it as validation, as an opportunity to finally be heard, to finally make him understand what he'd done. But I wasn't the old me anymore. I'd spent months rebuilding myself in silence, learning that my worth wasn't determined by whether he acknowledged the truth. I ignored the message. And then I made my one strategic move, the move that would trigger everything that came after. I wrote a letter. Not to Derek, not to my friends, not to social media. I wrote a formal, detailed letter to the HR department at Derek's new company. I'd found out through professional networks where he was working, a tech startup with a strong culture emphasis and strict policies about workplace conduct. In the letter, I didn't make accusations. I didn't tell them he was a bad person or demand they fire him. I simply stated facts. I explained that I'd been in a relationship with Derek, that the relationship had ended badly, and that he'd subsequently engaged in a pattern of behavior that included contacting my workplace, spreading false information about me professionally, and using professional networks to damage my reputation. I included documentation. Emails from my former colleague showing that Derek had reached out to him fishing for information about me. Screenshots of the networking event where he'd spoken to the senior partner at my firm, confirmed by the partner himself when I'd finally gotten the courage to ask him about it directly months later. A timeline of events that showed a clear pattern of deliberate professional sabotage. I didn't do this to hurt Derek. I did this to protect the next person. I did this because I knew that someone who would go to such lengths to destroy an ex professionally wouldn't stop with just me. And I did this because it was legal, ethical, and true. I wasn't lying. I wasn't manipulating. I was simply ensuring that there was a record of his behavior with a company that would take it seriously. The letter included a clear statement: I am not seeking any specific action or outcome. I simply believe that employers should be aware of patterns of behavior that could impact workplace safety and professionalism. I wished Derek well in his career and personal life, but I felt ethically obligated to ensure this information was on record should any similar issues arise in the future. I sent it certified mail. Then I let it go. I didn't tell anyone I'd done it. Didn't wait anxiously for results. I'd said my truth to someone who had the power to actually do something with it, and then I went back to focusing on my own life. 3 weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Derek had been placed on probation at his new job. Apparently, HR had taken my letter seriously, had conducted their own investigation, and had discovered that Derek had already been the subject of complaints from 2 female co-workers who felt he was too intense, too invasive, asking too many personal questions. My letter had provided context for a pattern they'd already been noticing. They'd spoken to him formally, warned him that any further incidents would result in termination, and were now monitoring his interactions more closely. But the real karma came from an unexpected place. Melissa, his girlfriend, worked at a company that was partnered with Derek's startup. When Derek's behavior at work became a topic of professional discussion, word spread. Melissa heard about it. Heard about the letter from an ex detailing manipulation and professional sabotage. Heard about the complaints from co-workers. And she started asking questions. She reached out to me. I almost didn't respond. What could I possibly say to her that wouldn't seem vindictive? But her message was so raw, so clearly coming from a place of desperation and confusion, that I couldn't ignore it. We met at a coffee shop. I told her everything. Not to poison her against him, but because she deserved to know the truth. I showed her the documentation, explained the patterns, and told her that whatever she decided to do with the information was entirely up to her. I wasn't trying to break them up. I was just refusing to let another woman go through what I'd gone through in the dark. Melissa broke up with Derek 2 days later. And she did it publicly, at a gathering where many of his friends were present. She didn't make a scene, didn't yell, or cry. She simply stated calmly that she'd learned things about his past behavior that made her uncomfortable, that she'd noticed similar patterns in their relationship, and that she was choosing to prioritize her own mental health and walk away. The people who'd believed Derek's story about me, who'd seen me as the villain, now watched him lose another relationship in almost identical circumstances. The cognitive dissonance was too much. If one ex was crazy, maybe. But 2 exes saying similar things? A pattern of workplace complaints? Suddenly, the simple explanation wasn't that both women were unstable. It was that Derek was exactly who he'd said he was. I didn't celebrate when I heard. I didn't feel vindicated or victorious. I felt sad. Sad that it had come to this, sad that Melissa had to go through any of it, sad that Derek seemed incapable of seeing what he was doing to the people who cared about him. But I also felt free. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe fully. The reputation he'd destroyed was rebuilding itself without me having to fight for it. The friends who'd abandoned me were reaching out with apologies. The professional credibility I'd lost was being restored as the truth came to light. My boss called me into her office one morning. I went in prepared for anything, still carrying that anxiety that Derek had instilled in me. Instead, she apologized. She explained that she'd heard things during my relationship with Derek, had let those things color her perception of me, and now realized she'd been unfair. She offered me the promotion I'd been passed over for, along with a sincere commitment to ensuring I felt supported at work. I accepted, but I also told her the truth. I told her that the experience had taught me to be more careful about believing second-hand information about anyone. That I hoped the company would be more thoughtful about how personal relationships and workplace dynamics intersected. That I appreciated the apology, but what I really wanted was a guarantee that this wouldn't happen to someone else. She listened. And she actually implemented changes. New policies about how personal accusations were handled, training about the impact of gossip and reputation damage, a clearer process for employees to report concerns about harassment or manipulation. It didn't fix what had happened to me, but it might prevent it from happening to someone else. Derek, from what I heard, spiraled. He lost his job 6 months after the probation, not because of my letter directly, but because he couldn't help himself. He'd become defensive, combative with co-workers, unable to accept feedback without seeing it as personal attack. The same patterns that had destroyed his personal relationships eventually destroyed his professional ones. He tried to reach out to me multiple times. Long messages that started with apologies and ended with blame. Attempts to rewrite history, to claim we'd both made mistakes, to suggest we should talk and find closure. I never responded. Not out of cruelty, but because I'd learned that engaging with him meant being pulled back into his reality distortion field. Silence was protection. The last I heard, he'd moved to another city. A fresh start, probably. A new place where people didn't know his history, where he could rebuild his image. Part of me hopes he's actually changed, actually sought help, actually confronted whatever drives him to hurt the people who love him. But most of me knows that people like Derek don't change until they are forced to, until the consequences become too severe to ignore. I rebuilt my life slowly. Made new friends, deepened relationships with old ones who'd proven they were willing to question their assumptions and admit when they were wrong. Dated cautiously, learning to recognize red flags early, trusting my instincts when something felt off. I changed careers too. Left the marketing firm not because I was pushed out, but because I realized I wanted something different. I went back to school part-time, got certified in counseling, and now I work with people who've experienced emotional abuse and gaslighting. I use my story not as a horror tale but as a roadmap. This is what it looks like. This is how it happens. This is how you survive it. This is how you rebuild. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where I suddenly became strong and confident again. It was hundreds of tiny moments. Mornings where I woke up and didn't immediately think about what Derek had done. Evenings where I made plans based on what I wanted, not on what someone else would approve of. Conversations where I stated my truth without apologizing for it. I learned that revenge is overrated. The fantasy of confronting someone who hurt you, of making them understand, of forcing them to acknowledge the damage they caused, it rarely plays out the way you imagine. Most people who hurt us never fully understand what they've done. They never have that moment of clarity where they realize they were wrong and we were right. But karma, real karma, isn't about fairness or justice. It's about consequences catching up with choices. Derek didn't suffer because I punished him. He suffered because he kept being exactly who he was, and eventually, people saw it. The universe didn't intervene on my behalf. Reality did. Truth did. Time did. The sweetest part of this whole experience wasn't watching Derek face consequences. It was rebuilding myself into someone I actually liked. Someone who set boundaries. Someone who didn't apologize for existing. Someone who could spot manipulation from a mile away and walk away without guilt. I don't hate Derek anymore. I don't think about him much at all, honestly. When I do, it's with a distant sort of pity. How exhausting it must be to live that way, constantly constructing narratives, controlling perceptions, unable to just exist honestly. How lonely it must be to keep pushing away everyone who gets close enough to see the real you. My life now is quiet in the best way. I have friends who actually know me, who I don't have to perform for. I have work that matters, that helps people, that uses my worst experience to create something useful. I have peace, which is worth more than any dramatic revenge could ever be. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled it. If I wish I'd fought harder, confronted him directly, made sure everyone knew exactly what he'd done. And the answer is no. Because fighting would have kept me connected to him, kept me focused on his narrative, kept me trapped in the story he'd written where I was the villain. By stepping back, by focusing on my own truth rather than fighting his lies, I took away his power. I stopped letting him define my reality. And eventually, his lies collapsed under their own weight because lies always do, given enough time. The lesson I learned isn't about revenge or karma or justice. It's about the power of simply refusing to participate in someone else's manipulation. When you stop defending yourself against false accusations, stop trying to convince people who've already decided not to believe you, stop letting someone else's version of reality override your own, something shifts. You reclaim yourself. You remember who you were before someone convinced you that you were the problem. You realize that the people who matter, the relationships worth keeping, those don't require you to constantly prove your worth. They exist in a space of mutual respect and trust, not constant surveillance and defense. If you're going through something similar, If you're trapped in a relationship or recovering from one where someone made you doubt yourself, made you feel small, made you the villain in their story, I want you to know this: your reality is valid. Your experience is real. And you don't need them to admit what they did for it to be true. Document everything, not for revenge but for clarity. For those moments when you start to doubt yourself, when their gaslighting lingers in your mind like smoke. Write down what actually happened. Keep records. Trust your memory even when someone tells you it's wrong. Let time and truth do their work. The people who matter will see it eventually. The reputation they destroyed will rebuild itself if you focus on being consistently, genuinely yourself. The consequences they've earned will find them without you having to deliver them personally. And know that healing isn't linear. There will be days when you're angry, days when you're sad, days when you can't believe you let it get so bad. That's normal. That's human. Be patient with yourself. You're not just recovering from a relationship. You're recovering from having your reality systematically dismantled. That takes time. The sweetest revenge, if you can even call it that, is becoming someone they can't hurt anymore. Someone who's built a life so full, so genuine, so aligned with your values that their lies can't touch it. Someone who hears their name and feels nothing, not anger, not pain, not even satisfaction at their struggles. Just nothing. Indifference. Peace. That's where I am now. That's what this whole painful, messy, difficult journey led to. Not vindication, not victory, but something better. Freedom. The freedom to be myself without apology. The freedom to trust my instincts. The freedom to walk away from anything that doesn't serve me without guilt. Derek tried to erase me from my own life. Instead, he forced me to rebuild myself into someone stronger, clearer, more grounded. Someone who knows her worth isn't up for debate. Someone who understands that people will believe what they want to believe, and that's okay because the only approval I need is my own. So if you're waiting for karma to strike, waiting for justice, waiting for the person who hurt you to finally understand what they did, I want you to consider this. What if you stopped waiting? What if you focused every ounce of that energy on building a life so beautiful, so authentic, so completely yours that their chapter becomes just a small, manageable part of your story? That's the real karma. That's the real revenge. Not their suffering, but your joy. Not their consequences, but your peace. Not them finally seeing the truth, but you finally seeing yourself clearly again. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted my life back. And somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't want my old life back at all. I wanted a new one. A better one. One where I was the author, not the side character in someone else's manipulation. That's what I built. That's what I have now. And no one can take it from me because it's not based on anyone else's validation or approval. It's mine. Fully, completely, undeniably mine. And that's sweeter than any revenge could ever be.